Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. Today, we'll be having a look at the Nikon DF. The camera appears to be having a bit of a resurgence, and honestly, I can kind of see why. A vintage-styled, dial-laden DSLR? What's better than that? Really, not much. So, of course, when I found one at a very agreeable price, I literally couldn't say no, and my money disappeared from my wallet. So let's have a look at where my money went. Into this. I want to plug a thing. Did you know I have family? And specifically, I have a brother. He's actually very good at the photo takey and video shooty, and he recently decided to start his own YouTube channel. So, if you feel like watching more camera and photography or video related content, feel free to check out his channel. I'll link to it in the description below, or you can look it up. It's called Chang of Fools. What is the Nikon DF? Obviously, it's this camera right here. It is, of course, a full-frame DSLR camera, and it was announced in November of 2013, featuring a 16-megapixel CMOS sensor, the same one found in Nikon's flagship D4. The sensor and camera have an ISO range of 100 to 12,800 or 50 to 204,800 with the expansion enabled. That's a lot of expanding. The shutter is good from 30 seconds to 1/4000th of a second, so they saved a bit of dollars there. And the flash sync is up to 1/250th of a second. The DF will shoot at up to 5.5 frames per second, and that's good for around 21 RAWs. The autofocus on the DF is handled by the Multicam 4800 FX. This is the same unit on the D600 and D610. It features 39 points, with 9 of those being cross points. When it comes to metering, it uses the 3D color matrix metering system 3, which employs a 2016 pixel sensor to do the job. The rear of the camera is equipped with a 3.2-inch LCD featuring 921K dots. That's enough dots. There is also an OVF. Obviously, it's a DSLR, and this features 100% coverage at around 0.7 times magnification. The DF is powered by Nikon's EN-EL14 batteries. This is one of the smaller ones, but even so, it is rated for 1400 SEPA rated shots. With the battery in the camera, this camera comes in at 760 grams. That is quite light. And when this was new, the DF came in at $2,749.99 USD, all the way in the back of 2013. That seemed to be at least 100 years ago. And that's around 3,833 future coin, or roughly 5,300 Canadian winter ice dollars. What makes the DF special? Obviously, styling is a bit of that. Styling and operation. They are different from your normal Nikon DSLR, which we'll get into in a little bit. But the DF has another party trick, and as far as I'm concerned, it's a very, very good one. And it's this. The camera can do this. Okay, let's see. Okay, see that? See that little thing there? See the tab? It does that. Did you catch that? That's the AI coupling lever. And it can fold away. This is the lever, for those of you who don't know. It's the thing that transmits the lens aperture to the camera body. On AI and newer lenses, there's a ridge, and it uses that ridge to connect with this camera. And up till G series lenses, all Nikon lenses have this ridge for aperture control. Whether or not they're used depends on the camera that you're using. But here's the thing. You may have noticed I said that it folds away. And this actually means that older non-AI indexing lenses can be mounted. Not only that, but you do retain some metering functions. If you set the camera's aperture on the camera and match it to the lens aperture that you're on, the camera will calculate the appropriate metering for you. Nice. So aside from the DF, the only other DSLRs that can mount non-AI lenses are apparently the DSLRs that don't have a focus motor built in, generally. Think Nikon D40, D3000 series. But those cameras only work in full manual mode. There's no form of metering of any sort when you mount those lenses on. So this is the only one that'll give you that ability. So why does that even matter? Obviously, it's because it lets you potentially mount Nikon lenses from the inception of f-mount. But also, those lenses look pretty cool when paired up with the DF, not like this kind of modernish AF-D lens here. So that's kind of neat. Okay, I kind of get that it's not a huge deal in the era of mirrorless cameras where you can combine any lens from any manufacturer, use a dumb adapter, and put everything on anything. You can mount all manner of f-mount glass on any mirrorless camera. And on at least my Sony, I can make it autofocus with my TechArt adapter, which is double neat. But there's something to be said about using an OVF rather than an EVF, which we'll get into in a little bit. All right. I also kind of fibbed when I said they had one party trick. I guess 1.5. The last thing is that this camera borrows the sensor from the D4, which was considered something of a flagship camera. And admittedly, if you look at the numbers and you look at charts, you'll probably think, what's the matter? What's so good about it? But I'll say the D4 sensor and subsequently the sensor in here is pretty sweet. I like it very much, and it's worth pointing out that it has the D4 sensor in here in a much smaller package. Operation and feel. The DF could have been perfect. But before we get into that, let's start by saying that the DF has a lot of little things that kind of raise eyebrows. But for every little thing that it does weird, it does something awesome, almost. And we're gonna get into that right now. The feel of the camera is how we're gonna start things off. The DF, admittedly, it's light. It's Nikon's lightest full-frame DSLR. This is both a pro and a con. First, I don't mind it, but it is something of a bit of a weird mixture because it is both lighter and bigger than some of Nikon's other DSLRs, and it's actually lighter and bigger than my ancient Nikon F2. And when you hold them side by side, it does make it feel like the DF is just a lot less substantial, because it is. It's a solid 100 grams less. So in my hands, my brain doesn't quite match things up with what it thinks this should weigh. Part of that, again, is the aesthetic and having it directly beside my F2 right now. But I can appreciate it when it's in my bag, because the weight savings is pretty noticeable when you compare to other Nikon DSLRs. The DF is actually, despite its lightness, still made using magnesium alloy. It's just apparently thin because they focused on weight a lot when making this thing. And the thing that's kind of nice about the lightweightedness is that you can kind of get away with a less substantial grip on this camera, which adds a kind of interesting styling to it because it's not flush like the F2, but it's not chunky like other DSLR grips. Something in between. And I personally think with shorter lenses on the DF, it is still very comfortable. And it's enough of a grip that you get good comfort, but not enough that it ruins the retro aesthetic. Additionally, on the rear, you get a subtle rear thumb rest. And again, it's one of those things where it's subtle enough that it doesn't greatly affect the look, but enough that it makes things comfortable. And part of this, to be honest, is that it uses a pretty thick amount of rubberizing around this entire area so that you do get a nice surface to grip onto, but it's nice that this was done. The attention to detail for the little front grip and the rear thumb rest. However, that is something to actually be aware of when going forward. These cameras are getting a bit old, and I can feel on mine that there's a bit of loosening in some of the areas of the rubber. So keep that in mind when shopping for these things. When it comes to operating the camera, things are again mostly very nice, with one or two odd foibles. Let's start with the standard bits on this camera. The rear. This feels just like any other Nikon DSLR. You get your controls on this side of the camera, the left, and they focus on things like the image playback, menu options, that sort of thing. Those buttons are clustered on this side. On the right, you get things that are mostly related to shooting options and things like the info button and pulling up the live view. Of course, this is Nikon pre-discovering the AF joystick, so instead you have the D-pad, which is still a pretty good setup. And the menu on this camera is familiar and Nikon-y, so it's easy to navigate. So let's get into the good stuff. Let's ease our way in. The camera features the standard dual command dial layout that you come to expect. The one on the rear, it's a very normal, very exquisitely placed thumb one. The one in the front, that's this thing here. And it is quite pretty. And I do like that Nikon decided to go with this retro styled looking command dial. It seems generally though it's regarded as a con. Complaints were that it required a little too much force to use and the placement wasn't perfect. But I personally think that it is fine. It isn't perfectly comfortable like the one found on the Nikon D700. And yes, it does require a little more force, but the use of it is pretty satisfying. There are kind of hard ridges on the side, and it does make it feel like a classic camera control, even if I don't think Nikon actually did any of their controls this way. There were some other film SLRs that did though, and I'll see if I can put up a picture of that somewhere, if I can find a picture of it, where they had, I think shutter speed would have been here. I know on older like rangefinders, the slow speeds were on a dial that was in this area. But moving on, other good stuff. The top plate is perhaps the most interesting of plates. This is probably why the camera is picked up in popularity. The DF is Nikon's first retro-inspired camera. It is the daddy to the ZF. And as a result, there are many dedicated controls. Mostly, they make sense. You got a shutter speed dial, you got drive control underneath there, you have your on-off thing flanking your shutter button, it's right there. And enough of the things are just very well styled. The thing is, though, that all of these things also have interlocks, which is a bit different than a film camera, at least on the ones that I'm used to seeing, but you do gotta press it down and rotate. But with the on-off button or switch, it is just a shroud, and you can just flick the camera on or off with one finger. It is, again, a bit of extra force, but it's, I think, very cleverly done so that you do have to intentionally flick it on, and it's very difficult to accidentally do it. Additionally, the camera also has, what you might have noticed, is a very tiny top display. And I actually think it's pretty good given its minimal size. And let's have a look. I don't know if you can see it. Its illumination is just a light color. Pretty bright, pretty neat. On the left side of the top plate, we have other dedicated dials. My favorite one, the exposure comp, right over here. Underneath that, you have an ISO dial. Both are great and nice, easy to see and use. And with the trio of dials, with your exposure comp, your ISO, and your shutter speed, as well as your aperture ring, you're pretty well set. But something that I did kind of get annoyed with was all the interlocks that are on the camera. I don't mind that they're there. I do wish that they weren't the hold down and twist. I do like the ones on my GFX, which are a press, and then you can twist and then press again to lock. I do find that just a little bit nicer, but it's not the end of the world that the DF does it different. But what I don't care for, though, is this. Can you see it? It is a slightly clumsy PASM implementation. And I honestly am not super sure why they didn't just start sticking auto on your dedicated shutter ISO dials there. And they probably could have found a solution for the aperture rings. But yeah, I would have preferred if they, again, just cribbed that off of Fujifilm's method of setting the auto modes. I find this dial is just, it's nice, and the action to pull it up and twist is cool, but I would have preferred just an A mode on some stuff and not having this dial or having it be something else. But it's honestly fine. And at least the PASM dial, as I said, does feel like a control from an old camera. Again, kind of like setting the shutter speed on an old Leica 3 where you lift and twist. So the control is itself good. It's what it controls that I don't like. Now, one thing that I did notice, though, is that without the auto ISO being a position on the dial, I found it a bit annoying, but there's a solution to that. You can actually map the auto ISO toggle to one of these front controls. So you can press it and use the command dial to toggle auto ISO on and off, which I did because I really do like having control of auto ISO. So yeah, something to look into if you do get one of these things. But that said, once you get used to the way the DF itself works, everything is quite nice. And it's just a fairly good feeling camera to operate, and the clicky controls really do contribute to that feel. Image quality and autofocus. The 16 megapixel sensor on the DF is something that I think when this camera originally came out was, again, something that stumped the community a little bit. Sure, this was a sensor off the flagship D4, but unlike the D4, the DF can't give you insane burst speeds. It only shoots 5.5 FPS, not a bajillion like the D4 does. So it's harder to see why this sensor should be in this camera, especially considering that the Nikon D600, D610 of the same era had an arguably very, very good sensor from Sony, offering more resolution, more dynamic range, while ending up costing a little less money. The DF, though, offered better noise performance, and the sensor itself, being a flagship sensor, was designed in-house by Nikon and produced by the company Renaissance? I'm sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. And yeah, so the D600 and D610 use Sony designed and Sony produced sensors, meaning that the DF kind of has a more bespoke solution, which I personally think is pretty cool, even if you sacrifice some resolution and some DR. Either way, the sensor in the DF produces lovely files, and while dynamic range is, yes, a little less than modern contemporaries and a little less than the 24 megapixels of old, I don't think that it's hugely short, and it's more than good at what it does and for what I want it to do, which is allow me to chat to you about this like a madman, which is what I'm doing right now. But with that said, let's have a look at the noise performance of the DF. I'm gonna be honest here. I actually do think that the entire non-expanded ISO range, 100 to 12,800, is very good, very usable. And even the 25,600 works well with a little bit of NR. I'm sure I could probably push higher, but I've never really felt the need to go to 50K, not realistically anyways. But even accounting for the resolution differences in the DF and other sensors, I'm pretty happy to shoot the DF at these high ISOs. It seems like this thing can basically do a pretty good job shooting in the dark. Well, the sensor can. When it comes to autofocus, I'm probably, apparently, more forgiving than most people. I admit though that if I bought this new and I paid the new MSRP dollars for it, I might be a bit miffed that I got the same module as the D600. And I do get that the criticisms for the module on the DF are fairly reasonable. The module itself doesn't cover a huge area of the frame, and overall, the performance isn't stellar like other Nikon DSLRs, like the D700 or D800. But 100% honest, I still don't think the module is that bad. The DF is one of those cameras that I end up shooting with the center focus point anyways to recompose, and it's not just because the module performance is bad, but it's kind of just how I operate when I mount glass on this camera. And when I'm using non-AI or pre-AI lenses and I have the autofocus dot set to tell me where my focus is, it's on the center. And I generally think that it does a pretty good job of telling me when I'm on point. But I do get the criticism for the AF module on this camera. It is not perfect, and I also kind of get why Nikon put it in here given the lower shooting speed. Again, 5.5 FPS. So the module itself isn't expected to be taxed super hard tracking a bajillion things. But with that, let's have a listen at the 5.5 FPS. And let's boop, boop, and honestly, kind of an understated sound. It does a little bit remind me of older film SLRs, less clacky for sure, but quieter, right? Like, let's listen to... This is definitely a higher pitch, but the DF kind of feels a little older just because it is generally quieter than the chunky chunk sound that you get on like a D800 or D700. One modification really makes the DF the camera that it should have been. It makes it nearly perfect. If you're someone that looks at the DF and does not want to put any vintage glass on this camera, why are you looking at the DF? Ignore this part of the video. For everyone else, time to pay attention, maybe. This could apply to you. A tiny bit of context, well, maybe you don't need it, but I'm gonna say it anyways. The DF style and the blend of controls screams manual focus glass. And the intentional choice to allow non-AI lenses to be mounted makes this one missing feature real weird, because it does really seem like Nikon wanted you to put old thingies on the new camera. And what it's missing is focus aids, specifically through the optical viewfinder. This camera just has your standard matte finish focusing screen. And those are optimized for autofocus lenses. And yeah, they're pretty good at maintaining overall good brightness through the finder through a wide range of apertures. All great things. But it really takes away from the experience of using manual glass, especially when you've gone through all the trouble of designing so many features that make it seem like you want people to do that. Sure, you got the built-in focusing aids using the AF module to indicate focus. And while for me, I think it's generally pretty accurate, it is less engaging than trying to focus using an actual split prism. Trying to focus using the AF module, always trying to peer in the left corner for that focus confirmation dot, kind of pulls you away from things a bit. And it's, again, a shame based on how much effort went into the design of this camera and giving it the ability to do that mounting of non-AI glass. So what are your options realistically? 1, live with this less than ideal system. 2, use live view, which is even worse because now you're pulling yourself out of that immersion. Or 3, my favorite option, buy an third-party unsupported focusing screen, a split prism one. That's the third one, and honestly, the best one. Again, this is an unsupported mod of the DF. Not that it super matters now anyway, since I'm pretty sure Nikon aren't supporting these anymore, but originally and now, Nikon hasn't really supported interchangeable focusing screens on its DSLRs, even for a while when the DF was new. So the DF not supporting this was no exception. However, it doesn't mean that it can't be done. In spite of how this camera is currently over a decade old, I was actually still able to find third-party manufacturers who made a classic horizontal split prism for the DF. So, of course, I paid cash money and I ordered one. Installation was pretty trivial. It was basically the same as installing a focusing screen on any other camera, like a Canon DSLR. And if you're interested in that, I will link to the instructions below on both where to buy a screen and how to do the install. But what's it like now that it has a split prism focusing screen? More honesty here, I'm a little bit biased, but it makes me forget all of the camera's weird little foibles. I don't care about the little PASM dial anymore. I don't care that these other dials don't have an A mode on it. When I shoot through and I see through the split prism, the immersion that this camera offers increases dramatically, many times, whatever metric that happens to be. But yeah, it really is quite a bit more immersive shooting this camera. Now, not only does it look like an old SLR, it shoots like one. And it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And let's be honest, the old film SLRs, they're not perfect either. They had foibles too. This is awesome, but it's not perfect. When I'm using these older SLRs, when I'm focusing through that big finder with its split prism, I also tend to forgive a lot of the weirdnesses of these older SLRs. And obviously it is true for the DF. I'm willing to forgive a lot of things with the split prism in place. With the split prism, the DF feels whole. It feels finished. It feels like the camera that should have came out all that time ago. And when I'm using the split prism, I do think that I'm personally a little bit faster manually focusing than using the AI or using the built-in confirmation dot. It ain't AI. But am I really faster? I don't know, but it feels that way and I like it. Am I faster than this camera using its autofocus module? No, definitely not. But with a nice bright 51.2 on it, I can pretty well reliably focus in the dark, something that I'm told the DF system ain't good at. So for those of you who hate the system anyways, the focusing screen might be the perfect way to circumvent it. But are there any downsides to the focusing screen? Well, a lot of the manufacturers give you a little warning that it may affect metering. I haven't really found that to be the case. Things still seem to meter perfectly fine. One thing that you will notice that if you are using slower glass, slower than 2.8, the finder will get darker, and that's kind of annoying. But that's the norm for these focusing screens, and again, kind of makes it feel even more film SLR-like. So is that really a downside? For me, no. One thing I can point out though that is a bit funky is using the AF system and selecting points. Yes, they overlay on top of where the split prism is, but you gotta get used to the like LED or the overlay projecting on top of the split prism. And that was just kind of weird for me. It doesn't affect AF performance at all. It's just something that was weird looking through the finder and still having control of AF points while having a focusing screen on it. But in short, I honestly think that this mod is a must-have, and I think it wasn't even that expensive. It cost me something like 50 or 60 Canadian dollar dues, which is effectively free for all you Americans out there. And again, this is how the DF should have come out of the factory. All right, with all of that, let's finally have a look at some sample images. recommendation and conclusion. As is tradition, we'll start with cost. The recent resurgence in the popularity of these things has really shoved the prices high. On average, I'm seeing that these are now going for some 1100 USD to some 1500 USD, which means that this is going for more than a Nikon D4. An objectively awesome camera as well. But admittedly, despite the shared sensors of both cameras, the DF is clearly aimed at different populations. And where the DF is meant to give you a tingle of old nostalgia, the D4 is clearly meant to be a pro workhorse of reliableness and ever-presentness. As it stands though, nostalgia is in high demand, so high that some copies of this decade-old DSLR have gotten sold for almost the current used rate of a Nikon ZF, which blows my mind. But that's where we're at. But with all that, I have said a lot of nice things about this camera. Do I recommend this thing? Generally, no. It is really quite expensive. For all the nostalgic itches that it scratches, I imagine that most people don't have the nostalgia itch as severe as mine. I should probably get that looked by a medical professional. Probably shouldn't be this itchy. But who is this really for? Other than me, obviously. It is very, very niche. It's for someone who wants the dedicated dials, someone who wants an OVF, and it's likely going to be someone who's going to buy the focusing screen mod and install it. Someone who basically wants to emulate that feeling of shooting on an old film SLR as closely as possible without actually doing it. For everyone else that's partway on the spectrum of I like the ZF or any manner of Fujifilm camera, that probably will scratch your nostalgic itch. No medical advice needed. You still get a lot of old looking dials, but you do get the benefits of an EVF to give you that modern touch. But for those of you who are on another part of the nostalgia spectrum, the part that wants to have the experience of manual focus glass and the experience of an OVF, a DSLR and just adding a focusing screen will likely also scratch that itch. And again, no medical professionals needed. And these focusing screens, I will also add, are also supported on a whole variety of, they're unofficially supported on a whole variety of other Nikon DSLRs. You can get them for the D700, the D800, D600, and Canon DSLRs, some of the older ones like the 5D2, supported focusing screens from the get-go, and you can still find Canon in-box focusing screens on the interweb. So in the end, while I can't generally recommend this DF, I personally really, really enjoyed the camera. It is as fun of a camera as I think I'll get, and currently supplants the D700. Even though the D700, I think, is ergonomically superior to the DF, since it is similar to the D200, and therefore the D700 and D200 are kings of modern design and ergonomic goodness. But for me, that itch comes back, and I really do like the ability to take advantage of mounting non-AI glass natively on a camera that was meant to have it, on one that I've equipped with my swanky focusing screen. And as I said, I'm willing to forgive almost every camera foible of the DF to shoot with this. But that's enough from me. Let me know what kind of opinion you had of the DF when this first came out. Did you also look at it and kind of scoff? Or were you a DF diehard from the get-go? If you were, you're rare. Because I definitely looked at it and went, oh, who would buy that? It turns out, me later in life. But let me know in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.